Good evening, my friends. I hope you're all doing very well. Tonight we're going to be learning chapter 15 in the laws of Shabbat in Maimonides, in the Rambam. And the Rambam continues to discuss these laws of transferring from one domain to another. What is allowed and what is not allowed on Shabbat. So the Rambam begins off by telling us that a person who is standing, let's say, is standing in a private domain on Shabbat. Now, he's allowed to move something which is in the public domain, not in the same domain as they are standing, in the public domain, up to 4 handbreadths. So that's about 3 feet or so. So a person is allowed to, or actually up to about 6 feet, is allowed to move something on Shabbat which is within the other domain. Similarly, the opposite, if you're standing in a public domain, you're allowed to move something which is inside a private domain up to 6 feet. So to also, if you have an animal which is in a private domain and its head is sticking out, so you are allowed to give it food, and you're allowed to stick your hand into the other property and give it food. So that's the general rule of the way things work on Shabbat. And the Rambam says like this, that if there is water dripping, coming down in the public domain, or in a private domain, let's say it's dripping off the roof, all right? So it's raining, and you're standing on public property, on public domain, and there is water which is dripping off the roof and it's coming down, and now you want to drink the water on Shabbat. So are you allowed to stick your head into the public domain and drink it if your main part of your body is not within that same domain? Because essentially now you're going to be drinking, only your head is in there, but your entire body is still outside of that domain, and essentially you're actually transferring the water from the public domain to from the private domain to the public domain, or vice versa. So the Rambam says like this: if you're just drinking, so then it's fine. If it's just with your mouth. If you have a cup or some sort of vessel, so it depends. If it's a simple vessel, maybe made out of just a simple material like clay or so on and so forth, so then it's fine. Because you're not worried about this cup which you're drinking from, that if it falls within that property, you won't grab it back. But if it is something which is a nice vessel, which now you're worried about this vessel, that you don't want to lose it, so if you're going to stick your nice goblet outside of your property into the public domain to fill it up with water from the water that's dripping down, and now your goblet might drop, you might go and pick it back up and bring it back into your domain, and that's not allowed on Shabbat. But if we're talking about just water which is dripping, and you want to stick out your head or stick out your hand and get water, like just physically actually with your hand grab the water, so then you're allowed to do that as long as you don't touch the wall or the pipe where the water is coming through, which is dripping down. So if you have a wall which has the roof is dripping water down the wall on Shabbat, and you're standing in a public domain, and now this water is coming down on a private house, so you're allowed to stick your hand and get the water as long as you don't actually touch the wall. Because if you do touch the wall, that means you're taking the water which is actually on the wall of the home, which is private property, and you're transferring it to the public domain. But if it's not actually physically touching the wall, so then it's fine. If you can't touch the wall, If you yourself don't actually touch the wall, so then that's fine. Because the water is just it's flowing down, and therefore it's fine. Then the Rambam goes in to discuss a slightly different type of idea. Imagine if you have a house. So we have a house, and now outside of the house, on one of the walls, there is a little projection. There is something which is sticking out. So either if it's it's just a little platform, it could be a larger platform, but something which is sticking out outside of the house. Not a full-size balcony, we're not talking about that yet, but just something smaller. So the Rambam says like this: if this projection, if this thing that is sticking out is above 10 cubits off the ground, so as we said yesterday, that the area of a public domain only comes up till 10 cubits. Above 10 cubits is already what is called the makom petor. Makom petor is a place which is a non-liable place, because it's above regular height of the ground of the public domain. So therefore, on Shabbat, you're allowed to use this space in your house. You're allowed to put something on top of it, and so on and so forth, even though it's not part of your house. But because since it is above the ground level, since it's higher than 10 cubits off the ground, so then you're allowed to put stuff onto it. But if it is below, if it's near the ground, it's within, let's say, a couple cubits off the ground, below 10, so then it's already considered as part of the public domain, and then you shouldn't put something on top of it on Shabbat. And that is all in the case when there is only one projection. But if we have two projections, so then it already starts getting complicated. Because since the first one is one domain, so to speak, in this makom ptor, in this area which is a non-liable area, it is one domain for itself. And then under it you have a second projection which is again another domain for itself. So there is a rule which says that you cannot have two domains within using the space of one domain. So therefore it won't work. So this is already where it starts getting more complicated. But that's the general idea. Now, how about if you have two houses? So you have two houses, and you have road going in between them. And you want to throw something from the second floor to the other house on the second floor. Or if you're standing on the roof of the house, from one roof to the other roof. Why would this be allowed? Because since we said that the public domain only is up till 10 cubits high, only the height just above the ground. So now, since we're so high up, so this is a makom ptor, this is a non-liable area. So we're allowed to transfer across from one to the other. So the Rambam says that if both of these places belong to you, and they're connected, and he says especially in a case where you have an eruv, which we'll talk about later what exactly an eruv is, but it basically is a way to connect these two places to make them into one, so then you're for sure allowed to do it. But if you're throwing from one height, and you're throwing it to a different height, a lower height, in the other property across the street, so then you shouldn't, because maybe you'll miss and it's going to fall down onto the ground. And then, if it's something which is of value, you'll go down and pick it up because you don't want to lose it. And you're taking it from the street into your house. But if it's something which is not really very valuable, so then it's okay, because we're not worried that you're going to go and go get it back. Then the Rambam continues by saying a very interesting law. He says, if a person has a house, And right on the side of their house, outside, on public domain, on public property, there is a well. Are you allowed to fill up water from this well and drag it right up into your house? So, essentially, you wouldn't be allowed to, because you're taking literally water that is found in a public property and you're dragging it up all the way. You're schlepping it by rope into your house, and it's going through the public domain and coming into your house. So that's not allowed. But imagine a case where you have a well. So you have the actual depth of the well, which is where the water is. But then, imagine if there is a heap which they dug out for this well. So there is a heap of earth which is around this well, and it's high enough of 10 cubits. So now, within this space of this well, it's actually a place of its own. It's a domain of its own. And once it comes above this heap of earth which is around it, which is all the contents that was dug out, now it's actually above 10 cubits. And ultimately, now it's above the space of the public domain, and it's a makom Torah. It's a place which is non-liable. And therefore, from a non-liable area, you're allowed to pull it in back into your house. So if you have a well which is right outside the person's house, so it's not that there is enough, it's very close. So now you can pull that rope and pull the jug or the barrel or whatever is that bucket with water, and lift it up above that space. And once it comes into the open area, it's already not public domain. So that will be allowed. Comes the question in regards to the same thing the other way. If you want to throw something from your house outside the window into the public property, so that's something which we're not allowed to do. But imagine if there is a big pile which is higher than 10 cubits high. So if there's like a big garbage heap outside, so then if it's a public large garbage heap which is higher than 10 cubits high, you would be allowed to throw out of your window and get it onto that garbage heap. But if it's a private garbage heap, so then, since it gets emptied every once in a while, it could be that you'll throw it and it's going to be empty and it's actually going to land on the ground, and that's not allowed to be done because you're transferring from a private property to a public. I hope you're following. I hope you're following along. Many different variations of cases, but we're learning the gist of how these rules apply in different scenarios, and how these different types of properties intertwine with one another, these different types of domains, and what would be allowed and what wouldn't be allowed. That's basically what we're doing. We're just going into the various details to understand properly how this all would work. So the Rambam continues by talking about if you have a well, which is not really a well, but more of a water conduit that passes through the courtyard. So technically, you should be able to take water from it on Shabbat. But the thing is like this. One second, let me just see what the Rambam exactly says. So, like this. If we have a well, or a conduit, which is 4 cubits wide, and it's 10 cubits deep, so now it's actually a domain for itself. So are you allowed to take water from there on Shabbat? Because you're taking it from the domain of the well to the domain where you're standing around it. So the Rambam says that technically you shouldn't be able to, because you're not allowed to transfer the water from one domain to another domain. So what do you have to do? You actually have to make a type of fence around the well, so that it should encapsulate the well within that domain. And then when you take the water out, you're bringing it into this area, within this walled-in, this gated-in area, and that will be fine. But if you don't have that gated-in area, so then essentially you're taking it from the domain of where the water is to the open domain, and that would not be allowed. Now, how about pouring water down a drain on Shabbat? This is a very interesting question, because think about it. If you have a drain hole in your property, and you pour water down into it, the water is going right out of your property into the public domain. So are you allowed to pour a cup of water or a bucket that you're trying to throw out some liquid, and you're pouring it right into the drain, and now it's going to go, automatically. The moment I pour it into here, it's going to go right out of my property into the public domain. So what's the rule? So the Rambam says like this, and it's very interesting what he says. He says, don't pour it directly into the drain, because then, obviously, it's going to go right out of your property, and that's not allowed. What you are allowed to do is to pour it near the drain. So you can pour the water near the drain. Ultimately, it will go into the drain, and it's going to go out of your property. But you didn't literally pour the water into a pipe that is taking it right out of the property. You poured it onto the ground. Now the water will drip into the hole, into the drain, and it's going to go out. That's already not yourself doing it. When is this? In other words, when does the above apply? In the summer. And it's very interesting that there is a difference between this. He says in the summer, it's very dry, and you want it to stay that way, so you want the water to leave. But in the winter, this drain is actually taking any water that is piling up in your garden, it's taking it right out. And now, you actually maybe want some water to maybe you want some water to stay around, and on the outside there is you want the water to be absorbed in the place of where the drain is pulling all the water out. So it's very interesting. So in the winter, since there is a lot of water, and it's pulling all that water out this drain, so you want that there should be more water in the area of the drain. So then you're allowed to pour the water onto the drain, so that it should add wetness, so to speak. But in the summer, when everything is dry, so then you're not allowed to. Very interesting. How about if a person is on a boat? And this is the way the Rambam completes this chapter. If a person is on a boat, a person wants to fill water on Shabbat. So, the question is, the area of the water, the ocean itself, is a Carmelit. In other words, it's not a fully public domain. It's not a private domain, but it's what is called the Carmelit, which is the in-between. So, technically speaking, you should maybe be allowed to do it, but the rabbis have put a stringency, so therefore you have to make a certain sign of something to show that that you are being careful in regards to the laws of Shabbat. So therefore, the Rambam says you should stick out a projection above the area where you're going to be pulling the water. Now that projection is a makom ptor, an area which is non-liable. It's a domain for itself. It's a projection. It's sticking out of the boat. And that now you're pulling the water from the ocean to that projection, to that little board that's sticking out of the boat. So that's fine. And now from there you're allowed to pull it into your home, into your boat. And the last idea which the Rambam talks about over here is in regards to a person who moves thorns on Shabbat so that people shouldn't get hurt. And he says that if it wasn't a public domain, so then you should move it slowly. In other words, if it's dangerous, you want to move this nail or whatever out of the way, so you should move it less than 4 handbreadths at a time. So that would be allowed. Because in a public domain, you're allowed to move something up to 4 handbreadths. In other words, the space of a person, that box of space, you're allowed to move. So you'll have to pick it up, move it a little bit, put it down, then pick it up again and move it again a little bit, and so on. But if it's a Carmelite, which is not a fully public domain, so then you're actually allowed to pick it up and move it. It's similar in a situation where there is, if, for instance, the Rambam says a case where you have a corpse that began to decompose and it's really sending out a very bad, foul odor, so then you're also allowed to move it away to do that. And the last part of this section, the Rambam says, and this is how we complete the chapter, is that if a person goes into the ocean on Shabbat, person is swimming, or just going into the water, when he comes out of the water, you have to be very careful, because you shouldn't carry the water that is on you on Shabbat. You're carrying the water. So you have to dry yourself off right where you got out, and only then can you start walking away. That's a very interesting thing, which has some interesting outcomes in Jewish law in regards to going to the mikveh, for instance. A person goes to the mikveh on Shabbat. That's where it starts getting complicated, but that's a different discussion. That is the chapter for today. I hope you all followed along. It was a little bit long, a little bit complicated, but this is the laws of Shabbat. All the best, and we'll see you.